Hey there, folks, and welcome back into the Northern Football Podcast. It's episode 203 of NFP. Ben Steiner alongside Alex Kogiruzik and Brendan Dunlop. And it's the post-series of Canada against Suriname, and Canada getting past Suriname with a 3-0 win last night. 4 times the fireworks went off, or maybe 5 times. The fireworks were a little bit trigger-happy last night at BMO Field, but Canada moving through into the Concacaf Nations League semifinals. It's about as much as we could have asked, but Brendan, how you doing? I know that it was certainly a late night for you on Canadian Soccer Daily.
These match nights always are, my friend. But yeah, appreciate y'all reading Canadian Soccer Daily and Waking the Red. And it's nice when you've got some crossover. There's a lot of Waking the Red readers that would, I think, love to have Jacob Shaffelburg back in the side. And to be honest, I think he would love that as well in a different situation. He was pretty open about it being a difficult year for him in Nashville. Obviously, it was a difficult year for the team that had pretty high expectations. But there's been a couple of Canadian men's national team players that the conversation about them playing for Toronto FC has been had over this international window. And I couldn't help but see Shaffelburg rip it up on that turf and imagine what it would be like if he was still playing for TFC.
And Alex, you were clipping in a bomb cyclone in Vancouver during the match.
What does that even mean?
Apparently high winds, which no problems in the bomb cyclone. My power was good. My training got canceled, which is a bit of a bummer. You know, I always love to go out and run like a dog, but maybe for the best. I had some work to do, aka the Canada men's national team game. So we survived the bomb cyclone. Put that in a t-shirt, Brendan?
I think, but it requires like so much explanation. Like that's the I'm thankfully you're only talking about a weather pattern, but like was there any like deaths or serious injuries related?
It could be like I don't know, bomb cyclone. It could be like some sort of like move. Like imagine that. Like forget the Maradona. I'm gonna rip out the bomb cyclone on Saturday. Let's see if anyone could stop me. But,
what U Sports town are you drinking in with Ben Steiner throwing back bomb cyclones? That's what it sounds like. To me. Hello, Dartmouth.
Dartmouth. What's that town? You know, the one, Ben, we commentated on them when they did the soccer and they lost like 11-0, like Algonquin Valley or something like that. What was that one called?
Or
Algoma. That's what
we're
going to
go to. Algoma's the
Algoma.
university, but it's in a fully legitimate place that I can't think of the name of.
But it just gives me the vibe of, well, we'll have a bomb cyclone in the bar at Algoma.
I mean, I feel like I've learned too many weather terms over the last few years, at least in BC, like atmospheric river, bomb cyclone. Like, there's just too much, and you could see them on, some like trendy bar in Vancouver that's like all over the 2 atmospheric rivers.
You know what? You could describe the rise of the Canadian men's national team as an atmospheric river that's just ripped through CONCACAF. How about that for a segue?
Yeah, we'll get into the CanMNT stuff instead of local weather in Vancouver, at least for Alex. But, of course, the CanMNT 3-0 over Suriname last night. Too bad that Bombito's goal didn't count, because that would have been great to see him get his first goal with the men's national team. They're off to the Nations League semifinals. Just initial reactions on that match, and I think it was a pretty strong match for Canada. They did not look scared at any point, Brendan.
Yeah, I didn't expect them to look scared as much as Canadian fans may have been scared until maybe the third goal went in, and it seemed like Canada had it done and dusted, and that there was no threat of an actual Suriname comeback. It was a good, efficient performance, and one that you want to see at home for Jesse Marsch's first game in general. A team that's struggled to score. Should they have had more than 3? Yeah, and the fireworks went off multiple times because it seemed as though they would have. But I think it's one that they can build off of. And in general, this is still a tournament, albeit spread out as long as it is, and you want to play to your best games. And now their biggest test in a long time is coming with Mexico in LA, and which will very much be a Mexico home match that this Canadian squad has never experienced. Because when they went to Azteca in COVID, with the stadium ban that was in place, in addition to a COVID capacity limit, they didn't have that real Mexican experience. It's going to be in Los Angeles, but it's going to be a real hardcore Mexican experience, which is going to be great for this team. Win or lose, this is going to be a really good lesson and a good test. And I think that Suriname was as well. And they showed a little better, Suriname did, than I expected to. I mean, it's easy to look at the world rankings and the gap between them and think like they shouldn't even be on the same airplane, let alone be in the same Class A in Nations League. But it's great to see that Suriname have improved. And the whole point about this Nations League, I think that's a great example, Alex, is that it was to make these other countries and these smaller programs better. And Suriname are a shining example of that, a team that will continue to surge up the rankings. And we won't be talking about them in the hundreds. They'll be sub-100 sooner rather than later.
Yeah, well, I saw that reference, right? That Surinam's 136 in the world. Canada should wash the field with them, right, or whatever. I think anyone who's seen Suriname, who sees that roster, sees how they played, that's a disservice to them and the level they have. Like, it's not like their team is full of guys they plucked off the street there in Paramaribo, right? Like, oh, you drive a truck, you can come start at left wing. Oh, you're a government official, you can play a left back. Although, I mean, remember when that government official played at striker for the Suriname team in Concacaf League? Man, long live Concacaf League! What a tournament that was. But, like, it's a good team. They got European guys playing in Serie A, guys playing in La Liga and in Championship. And I think that's a credit to Canada of how thorough of a performance this was, where they just didn't give Suriname a sniff across both legs. I think this shows how far they've come under Jesse Marsch, where they can put up a thorough, commanding performance. There's an identity there. That's a good thing to see. What I like is Canada's press was great. Fun fact, they had 21 final third recoveries in this game, which is the most they've had in a game under Jesse Marsch. This is actually the game in terms of output. Their press has been the best. They scored 3 goals for the first time under Jesse Marsch. All 3 goals, what are nice too. They're different kind of goals they need to score more of. Like, a lot of their goals have been from the press. No, the first goal was a set piece. My goodness, a set piece. Remember when we were talking about those? And then the other 2 were, one's a direct ball over the top. Jesse Marsch ball, play direct. And then the third one, go watch it again, the full sequence if you can. Like, they start the ball from the back, Sigur into the pocket goes out, Laird makes a run out wide, 5 passes, it's on his feet, he crosses into Shaffelburg. Like, that was beautiful. That was Marsch ball. It was direct, vertical, but there was also a little tiki-taka, a little bit of flair. Canada's got the confidence to start doing that now, and I think that really stood out. It's like it's starting to look like Marsch ball out there, and it's going to be a term that I'm sure we're going to be saying a lot more if they keep playing like this.
Yeah, I think after the game as well, we spoke to Stanley Menzo, the Suriname coach, and he was, a little bit distraught in terms of just how badly his team was outplayed. He said, Canada was faster. We don't play at the tempo. They dominated us in possession and out of possession. It reminded me a little bit of I think it was the Danish World Juniors coach a while back when they played Canada at the World Juniors and lost 50-0. And it was just, they skate faster, they hit harder, they're bigger, they're better, they're stronger. And that's kind of what it reminded me of. And you've never necessarily heard that from, an opponent playing the Canadian men's national team, Brendan.
Yeah, no, great point. And I mean, it almost reminded me of a few years ago, certainly when Herdman took the job. Canada were where Suriname are at, where they feel as though they're better on paper. Things, look a lot stronger than ever. That's the strongest team on paper that they would have had in their program's history, as was, Canada's arguably in 2019 when they beat the United States, albeit with a bunch of young players who have now become superstars. But then when they went to Orlando and got played off the pitch, it felt like that gap that almost exists between Canada and Suriname now. It felt like that gap existed for Canada before. So they're kind of in that stretch now. But as I say, Suriname will not be a team that we're talking about in the plus 100s.
And Brendan, of course, you made your way back to a CanMNT game as well after missing, I think it was the last one that Tom was there for CSD. And the vibe last night was a little bit weird, but there were trumpets, and I think that added a lot to it, especially with just 13,000.
I think it took me and you an hour to realize the trumpets were Canadian and not Suriname trumpets, because I just assumed that they would be. So there was Ole Ole was going, and then in the 85th minute there was Jingle Bells was playing, which was a real nice treat. I think it was the guys from Tribal Rhythm Nation, or the Musical Connections anyway, because they were in that same section that Toronto FC Occupy or Tribal Rhythm Nation does. So yeah, it was nice. It was also rainy. November, Suriname. I think there's a lot of reasons why they only pulled 13,000, and I still think that the national program, isn't the most appealing soccer puller in this country yet. In most other places in the world, it is, and for Canada, it's never been that. So yes, the summer was big numbers, and the women's team in the Olympics will pull these, hopefully continue to set these record numbers, both the men's and the women's team in these big tournaments. But I'm not surprised that it was a little flat in comparison. It's just disappointing because this team is exciting to watch. So hopefully they've listened to this episode, they've read Canadian Soccer Daily, they've watched One Soccer, they've seen the match highlights, and they want to come out to the next one, because these games will continue to get better, and obviously they'll be bigger and bigger stakes.
We'll jump into your questions as well from Kaylee Etheridge. A January move has to be in the works for Jacob Shaffelburg, right? I wouldn't think so, because he hasn't necessarily delivered with Nashville, and I think the focus, and he spoke about it after the match as well, has to be having that consistency with his club that he's shown with his country, because there were a lot of up and downs, and honestly more downs for him this year at club level than there were, the ups at the national team level. So he needs to be a lot better at club level before he can get a transfer, because he's just not up to the star standard with Nashville, where he should be at given his performances with the national team.
Well, what I would throw out for next year as well, I think it's BJ Callahan's going to help, because I agree 100%. We've said it many a time, like until Shaffelburg gets that consistency with club, I think that's what's going to hold him back. I still think like teams will be interested in him, but they'll look at the club of, all right, like we want to see you prove it. But it is worth noting that under national, I think that maybe ended up being the downfall of Gary Smith. So they're too reliant on Hani Mukhtar, way too reliant. And it showed that when Mukhtar, who was superhuman for 3 years, finally showed any hint of human, like Nashville fell off a cliff. So I think hopefully BJ Callahan realizes that and realize like Shaffelburg can be a star as much as a Mukhtar can be a star. A Surge can be a star. They've got pieces there. Tyler Boyd, I think he'll still be there, and they'll add more to that team. They can all be stars in their own right. It doesn't have to just be the Mukhtar show, and then a Shaffelburg is basically like a glorified, trumpet player. Like he can be a piano player on that team. He can be a guy who sings, right? He can be a guy who's a front piece of that orchestra, and hopefully that helps. Because I agree, if he can have a good 10-goal, 10-assist season, which isn't unreasonable based on what he did this year for Canada, then he'll really get that interest to make that jump he deserves.
I love that we've taken this Nations League talk and gone hardcore MLS. BJ Callahan, who you guys know, and I'm pretty sure on this show I've said I was a huge fan of in the Nations League. Think that he should have been given a shout for the real U.S. job. Think that he should have been a Canadian candidate before Jesse Marsch became available as well. And who's my guy who's like a country music version of Adama Traore? Plays for Chivas, played for San Jose, young guy.
Oh, Cade Cowell.
Cade Cowell. In my mind was Caden Clark, Cade Cowell. BJ Callahan loves that guy. So to me, Shaffelburg is just like a smiley, thinner version, like a creatine-less version of Cade Cowell. That the sky is the limit for this. We could be talking about him going to Pachuca next. You know what I mean?
Creatine-less Cade Cowell is the most absolute wild comparison I've ever heard.
Put it on a t-shirt. Guy needs more nicknames. I was very happy, by the way, to do a quote tweet after Shaffelburg scored. I forget which goal it was, but Maritime Messi over MAGA Messi all day.
Yeah, that was Alex and I might get into it a little bit later, but the U.S. men's national team, in terms of big picture where Canada stands up, it'll be interesting to see whether the political ideals of some players on the U.S. men's national team impact where that national team could have its peak if they're not necessarily a unified locker room. But I know we've got questions on that in terms of a little bit big picture later on. But jumping into the next question from Ramsey at Ramsey_YY. Should Choinière be a dedicated set piece taker? It seems like every time he takes one, it's a breath of fresh air. I think it's still worth exploring. And that can also lead into the next question from Marsh plus Blue 2024 of whether Choinière and Kone is a battle, because Choinière can only take set pieces if he's on the pitch, and you have to look at which one of those midfield pivots is going to further benefit the national team. I still think Kone has that edge, in which case the set piece question for Choinière is somewhat moot.
I'm having some interesting thoughts on this, because what's really tough with what Choinière is doing right now is that it's clear that the best version of Jesse Marsch's defensive system, it seems to include Choinière. Like, I think it's no coincidence that games that it's been Choinière Eustachio, their press has been really good, right? Like in the U.S., when they played Choinière and Eustachio, they were all over the U.S., and having Choinière's athleticism was a huge plus in his work rate, and the way him and Eustachio are basically able to play right on top of the midfielders. And then there was the same thing in this game. Like Choinière and Eustachio were suffocating that Suriname midfield. They were struggling to play through them. They had to go direct. They had to go long. They only really got a hold on the game when it was 3-0. It was done and dusted. That's something where you do wonder if this Canadian team's identity is so based around the press, and Choinière really helps the press. Forget the set pieces. That's where I'm at in that regard. And I think it's, again, I continue to throw that out there, and I think we'll have to see it at some point. does that mean Kone at the 10, especially if De Zerbi gives him a proper run at the 10, opens up that question. Because I think the Chouanier press is the more important one, and the set pieces are a bonus because his delivery was great. I will give a hat tip, Stefan Steck. We were pretty hard on him last show because his deliveries weren't great. They were a lot better. I think overall Canada just benefited from actually working on the set pieces, and that's something that will help them going forward. Like we mentioned, they just need more patterns, more rhythm, etc. But Chouanier's pressing game is really what's opening questions for me.
For me, it's what are you sacrificing to have Chouanier be a regular? Like if you're prioritizing set pieces and that has him in the squad at the expense of Kone, who I don't think at the moment is ready to be the number 10 with Eustáquio and Chouanier behind him. But that could be the right fit come 26, as both of those guys get tremendous club experience under their belt over the next 14, 16 months, whatever it is, especially Chouanier, who every time Marsch seems to talk about him, it's almost like he's kind of hinting. Like, he's not, don't worry, you'll see him more frequently on the weekends. He's not going to stay a grasshopper for too long. I kind of feel like that's really, really a stepping stone spot for a player like that who's getting a lot more attention now, as are kind of all these Canadian men's national team guys. So the fact that you open up with a question about where's Shaffelburg moving, like I think that's not just the Canadian fans' kind of appetite, recognizing like, oh, these guys are really appealing players and really attractive players that teams must be fawning over. Like they are. People are paying attention. And Chouanier is definitely someone who has impressed more than I expected. I know that I was pretty harsh on Ali Ahmed early and thought he wasn't at this level, and I've said the same thing about Chouanier. I'm very happy to be proven wrong. And if Chouanier gets a start against Mexico and he's able to perform the way they did against Suriname, then to me that's just a greater example of how far he's come and an even better measurement. And I hope that we get the chance to see that, because it does seem like Canada have found something pretty special with that mix that I didn't think would be the right fit.
Yeah, you might be wrong on those two players, but at least you didn't say that Jonathan David wasn't delivering for the men's national team, because I've never looked like more of an idiot on that take.
By the way,
back on it.
I'll throw that out there because I looked this up, and I'm happy you brought it up because I was going to bring it up regardless. Jonathan David, 3 goals, 2 assists for Canada since Ben said that. So any other players we want, Lairn, you want to have a go at Lairn? You want to have a go at, maybe someone else who needs some goals for Canada?
Lucas Cavallini needs to be back in the Canadian picture, and we'll see if that comes anywhere. No.
We'll cut the feed, guys. Cut the feed. Cut.
Just in training, I want them to have Tani on smaller nets. Okay, and whatever the game scenario is, 5v5, 7v7, Tani has to be attacking these smaller and smaller nets, and then that will translate into him picking out those corners he's aiming for when he gets his opportunities on the pitch, or heading in the corners.
We play with smaller nets in 7-a-side. I know you just won your co-ed 7-a-side league with Queen's Park Strangers. Maybe you bring them out to get some target practice in co-ed league in Toronto?
Lucas McNaughton showed up at one of my games once, and I said, bro, I know you can't play. And he goes, no, I'm just watching the other team. I used to play for them. Like, thank God you don't play for them now. So, yes, it's possible that someone notable that we talk about on the podcast shows up at co-ed league, but I definitely identify him and complain to the referee, not eligible player.
And from Maple Leaf CanMNT, the depth seemed to be on full display last night, but to focus in on Hoylett, he is incredible with the ball. Do you think that he starts more games with the delivery being so good, as he tends to take a crack from distance as well and can also attempt a set piece? I don't think he's a starter for this national team. I think he has a place. He can be a leader on the team. He can bring that veteran presence. It was weird at the start of the match to see him and Johnston both honored for 50 caps last night, because you think of everything that Hoylett has seen since the 2018 cycle when he committed to Johnston, who still seems like a pretty fresh face, at least in terms of the years that he's been with the national team. And so to see them both honored for 50 caps was just like, wow, Hoylett is now a fringe player with this national team, and he was for a very short period of time a key component of this national team, especially as they were kind of going through that era where they were discovering what they were under Herdman.
Well, before I throw it to Brendan, by the way, just because this was on the broadcast and this made me laugh to the Hoylett point. Hoylett's 50th cap came against Japan, not in October 2023, in 2022 in November, right before the World Cup.
Before the World Cup, wow.
So I just want to throw that out there, that I think it's because Canada Soccer started honoring these guys and they're finally catching up to it. So I just want to throw that out there, that it's worth noting. It's been two years exactly since Hoylett got that 50th cap.
There's a rule, or they have a rule about not doing that for tournament games. So they didn't do it for the Gold Cup in Guadeloupe. because I think that would have been the natural window. But there's a rule about not doing that in a tournament game, so I think that's why. And because Nations League is a fringy tournament.
Well, no, it made no sense because Hoylett was in the squad for Jamaica, and I even want to say he might have been in the squad for Honduras in March of 23. So it just, I think they just missed it.
Sometimes it comes, I mean, we wouldn't put it past old Canada Soccer, that's for sure. Sometimes it just comes down to the guys like availability, like they can have their families around, they've got more time to do the extracurriculars and stuff, and I can see how there's a lot that goes into that. It's not as easy to put on, even though to us it might just look like a plaque presentation. There's a lot more that goes into it for those guys involved.
But yes,
in terms of the actual question, though, do you see him having potentially a greater role on this Marsch team?
I'll go quick on this. I think if they're in a scenario where it's the U.S. in the final, the Nations League. In LA, I think he has the potential to start, or at least be like one of the first players off the bench. And because I say that because what Jesse Marsch is weighing is preparing for 2026 and putting the best team out there, gaining with his players gaining the most experience, but also ending this damn 24-year trophy drought, and they got a real chance to do that. So he doesn't start against Mexico, but in the final, where it's like, okay, now the trophy is 90 minutes away. I can see him being a player that Marsch values in that scenario, but we're not talking about Junior Hoylett being Junior Hoylett's probably not in the squad come 2026. So I think that Marsch is weighing against that. So I do see a scenario, and especially with a mixed squad in the Gold Cup. How many players will they not have available, A-list players, because of the Club World Cup and rest and injury come that point? It's possible that he becomes an ace and a star again, because he's certainly one of the most experienced guys for Gold Cup. But Nations League is the first one, and I think Nations League is the one that will be the measurement of kind of where the program's at. Gold Cup would be nice, but Mexico sends their A team, the U.S. send their A team, and Canada wins. To me, that means more. So I think they want to win that trophy, and Hoylett could be a guy for them to do that.
I think Hoylett now, I think he has to be in the March squad. I think that much is clear, especially with the Liam Miller injury, especially with how the winger depth looks. But I think what's great with Hoylett is I think Marsch will realize his flexibility. You can play him as a second striker. You can play him out wide. He brings a bit of experience, which can always be valuable. And I still think Hoylett has the best shot of being in there in 26 among some of the vet names, just because of how his game's going to age. And I think what stood out this window is that the winger hierarchy for March is going to be Shaffelburg versus Buchanan on the left, especially if Buchanan gets minutes for Inter and starts to get some form. And we saw that last game with Buchanan coming in on the left, not the right. And I think Hoylett, he's going to be the Ali Ahmed backup. I think Marsch really has loved what Ahmed can bring as the 8.5, right? The winger who can cut inside and play as an 8. And I think that's why he's pushed Buchanan to be more of the Shaffelburg, stretch the defense, be a bit more direct. And I think Hoylett definitely fits that 8.5 mold. And I think he might be the only other quote unquote 8.5 that they have, right? Because Larea is not an 8.5. Maybe he could add that to his game. So I'd say keep an eye on Hoylett and Ahmed maybe being a bit of a 1-2 duo that Marsch uses in a game where it's maybe 70 of Ahmed and then 20 to Hoylett to close a game out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And from Ted Barta, Jeff Salisbury, and Nick Spirit, Niko Sigur gets significant minutes last night. Lots of questions on his role moving forward with this men's national team. He's mostly played right back so far, but he has played a 6 in a more defensive midfield role before. I'd like to see him in that role, but I was very impressed with how he showed in about half an hour last night.
Yeah, he doesn't look like a teenager, and he doesn't look like someone that's new to the program or the Canadian game, right? And Jesse Marsch had a really good point about seeing him in training, and he says to him, he's like, "Oh, that's a real Croatian pass." And Niko Sigur looks up and goes, "It's a Canadian pass, coach." And he's like, "Oh, right, it is a Canadian pass." But to Marsch's point, you don't see North American players develop with the skill set and the technicality that he clearly reads the game at, is why he appears, I think, to us, me anyway, having never played the game or studying it at the level that you guys study it, stands out the way that he does. The same can be said for Luc de Fougerolles, and you've heard members of the coaching staff say this as well, that there's just something different, that when he gets in there with those MLS guys, he does not look out of place, and he does not look like a teenager in comparison to some internationals that have 20, 30 senior caps. It's nice to have more and more of those guys in the squad, obviously to convert those dual nationals that are eligible. And Sigur seems like a guy that's going to have a big role in 26.
Yeah, I think what's nice with Sigur is that his versatility will only help him. I think this is good for Marsch because this has allowed him to ease him in, right? He's gotten minutes at right back. He's getting on the field. There's no log jam. I think it's circumstantial to answer the question of Ted's question of like, why is he playing right back? I think it's circumstantial, right? Like Johnson missed the second window and missed part of the first window where Sigur was in. No Davies this window, so the fullback depth is a bit lighter. Sigur allows to fill in and rest Johnson in this game, which was a smart call from Marsch. No need to run AJ into the ground in that regard. But yeah, I think profile, it's 100% a 6. He's built to play a 6. He's got the size, the skills, the ball playing. It was, Nick Spirit mentions it. Gattuso's starting to see him as a 6, and hopefully over the next 4 to 5 months heading into March, he just really gets reps at the 6 and dominates. But I think what's nice with Marsch that if you do have some fullback depth issues, because the fullback depth isn't great, right? Like after Davies and Adekugbe on the left and after Johnson and Leray on the right, it is a bit thin. Yeah, you can have Leray who can play on the left and etc. It's nice to know that Sigur, okay, he can be the next guy up as a right back, and you still have him in the midfield providing cover. Because I think long term that's got to be the goal for him.
And from Christina at Christina 6 yards.bluesky.social. What are your thoughts on Knight LaBelle being on the left? Was this Marsch wanting to see him on that side or avoiding Sigur and Jamie Knight LaBelle an experience on the same side to preserve balance at the back? And I think it was to preserve balance at the back. I'd like to see them, on their more natural sides, but it would have been very, imbalanced to have two teenagers on one side of the back line when you were still defending elite and you wanted to keep a clean sheet as well.
I think that's a very good shout from Christina, and just want to say I like a lot of what Knight LaBelle brought. Like he brought a good calm, a good poise. He didn't look like a 19-year-old kid making his Canadian debut, so shout out to him. He's obviously earned this opportunity. Marsch wouldn't have called him up again after the last window if he hadn't felt that's the case. He wouldn't have put him on the field. Why? Because literally in League 2, they don't take an international break unless you lose 3 internationals. Like Crew Alexander has been playing this whole week without him. Like you think Marsch wants to take him out of his club opportunity unless he deserves a national team look? No, and I think it's good now that he's provisionally cap tied for 3 years. They can follow his development. Now they know that, okay, if they need, maybe right now he's the 5th, 6th guy in the depth chart with Defugero, but they know between those two guys, they can step in if needed. And I thought that was really good to see.
Speaking of dual nationals, I did learn something on Tuesday night in the Suriname press conference, which most people just have their head in their phone and they allow the local media to ask questions. I did not realize that Justin Kluivert was still eligible for a switch. I also didn't realize, up until this window where I think he was capped again for the Netherlands, I also didn't realize he was only 25.
Yeah, he's young.
Like Justin Kluivert's 30. Like he's been around forever. He was washed when he left Roma before Jose got there. What are we talking about? Anyway, something I learned.
That would be a heck of a plug for Suriname. Justin Kluivert, my goodness. Bournemouth winger.
But amazing. Yeah.
I mean, as Menzo said after the match, like there's a lot of players that still think they have a chance with the Netherlands, and he clearly does, in terms of, still getting called up, that it's tough to convince players to come play for, 136th ranked Suriname.
Look how long Junior Hoylett sat on it, and there was so much conversation about Jonathan de Guzman and Junior Hoylett at the time when Canada went and lost to Honduras, that had they made the hex, those guys were ready to come. That was the conversation. Those guys were ready to come, and it didn't work out for either of those guys at the time. And I think that both of them are probably pretty thankful for that. Obviously, Jonathan de Guzman had the opportunity at the World Cup with the Dutch that he did, albeit not as many caps as he would have liked, of course. And Junior Hoylett was able to join Canada a little bit later, and he's played far more meaningful games than that team would have had they got to the Hex.
And Brendan just has to step aside to be Northern football dad, not to us, but to his actual son. But we'll jump into a couple more questions here before getting on to our big picture talk. From Afrikaans, who improved their stock this window and who did not? Which position group do you have the most concern with? And Skittles or M&Ms? In terms of the stock this window, I think probably has to be, Niko Sigur, what he showed in his 20 or so minutes. He looked solid. He looked like he could have a place in this team going forward. a lot of the other players have already improved their stock to the level that there is expectation, whereas Sigur, we were still kind of wondering like what we were going to see from him, and I think we saw, what his qualities can be.
Yeah, that's a good shout. I'd throw, Knight LaBelle. Just liked what he brought off the bench, and in terms of his potential, just gives you a reminder that between him and De Fougerolles, you're very excited to see the development of those two youngsters plying their trade in England. Both provisionally cap-tied for the next 3 years as well, which isn't bad as all. Otherwise, I'd say Richie Larea really improved his stock. He was fantastic, and man, I just feel like he's going to make some tough decisions come March of who starts, who sits out with how good Larea has been. So I'd add Larea, and I'll add Choinière in that mix as well in terms of the midfield. In terms of guys who've lost some stock, I guess Kone, in the sense that like it'll be curious to see where he fits in. I still think Kone should be an indisputable starter, but then it becomes a question of, where does that... Someone's getting sacrificed here between Choinière or Laren. So I'm curious to see what happens there with Kone. I think this will be a big 4 months with him. I think finally, hopefully he can just avoid injuries. There's no international breaks for a while. Like, go get a consistent run with Marseille. Really win a spot there, and I think that will make things a lot easier for everyone come March in terms of where he fits in this team, because he's still a very important piece. He's part of that core five for me. But other than that, wasn't really a window where many people dropped stock, which is good. A lot of people went up, right? You could add Waterman, you could add Kamal Miller, all guys that went up, and really not many people went down at all. And well, in terms of the other ones, position groups, I think, it's a good question. I think winger depth, you wonder if, maybe there could be a bit more winger depth, fullback depth as well as the two. And then in terms of the last questions, I'm Skittles, although I love Skittles, man. Great candy. And M&Ms are decent, but something about Skittles just gets me.
I think it's going to have to be M&Ms for me. I don't know why, but I would always have them when I was doing like something outdoors in the winter, and that cold like snap of the chocolate in an M&M, fantastic. Not peanut M&Ms. I am still allergic to peanuts. I feel like
I was going to say my favorite M&M is a peanut M&M.
I'm not having those, but the chocolate M&Ms I'll take any day over Skittles, because you get Skittles in the cold and they'll break your teeth. So M&Ms certainly getting my pick on that question.
I say shout out to that sort of fun question. You'd be surprised what kind of debates we could have on that sort of stuff, eh?
And from Pierre Olivier, we entered 2024 with a back five, and now I love our back four. What's the next tactical tweak for the 2026 World Cup? Finding our best midfield three. Is Sigur the solution at the bottom of the triangle with Kone and Eustáquio? Will we continue the 4-4-2 because of Schaff's directness? And, there's just a lot of options with this way the men's national team can play, and I think a lot of that will depend on how some of these, still fringe players start to develop. Niko Sigur with another year and a bit with the national team and with his club. Could he, as you say, transition into one of those important players? I think at this point, you're probably looking at still having that midfield pivot, and then the question is whether you're looking at Eustáquio Kone or Eustáquio Choinière.
Yeah, and I think, the third is it a 4-2-3-1 or is it a 4-2-2-2? I think what we've seen enough from Marsch to know it's going to be one of those two formations. I'd be really surprised if he pulls out like a 3-5-2 or a 3-4-3 or a 5-2-1. Like, he's not going to do any of that. I think it's going to be 4-2-3-1 or 4-2-2-2. It's going to press like a 4-2-2 regardless. It's just, do you have a 10 who can drop in as a build-up? And even then, when it's David up front, he's still the 10. So it is technically always going to be a 4-2-3-1. But I do wonder, especially against the high-level teams, if Canada's going to have to control a bit more of the game, if teams are going to be more alert to their press, having the third midfielder, I just feel like it's going to be a big bonus. And I feel like you look at the long-term options, I just feel like between a Sigur, a Saliba, or a Choinière, there's more of a chance of them really staking out a spot versus some of the forward options. We'll see how that ages, right? With forwards, it can flip on an instant. Maybe Promise David continues to pop off and we're having a different discussion in a few months. So there's, Taniel Owasi, Theo Bair, they can very much change this discussion. But I feel like the 4-2-3-1 would be the only change in terms of a third pure midfielder being something we see over the next few months.
And from Dave DeColla, this might be a hot take, but I think Bombito is currently the CanMNT's MVP from our recent results, and especially compared to Kamal's struggles in the first half.
It's hard to argue. I feel like you shout out to Dave. He also says, David is deserves a shout. And I think that's probably the debate right now, right? It feels like it would be a Bombito versus David. And I think you can make a very good argument for Bombito, because you take him away from that defense, it changes. Like, again, I said it earlier with how Surinam struggled this window, but guys like Bombito made them struggle, because every time they got anywhere close to the goal, he just shut them down, got his foot in, and he was good in possession, got an assist, almost scored. Like, he's doing it all for Canada right now. It doesn't matter who's beside him either at the back. Different fullbacks, different partners, no problem. Same Bombito. He genuinely feels like he's changed this team. So I think it's one of those where, look, I think in an MVP battle, I think David might just win based on how spectacular he's been, how important. Like, he is the attack. He's 8 of the 12 goals under Marsch. David has a goal or an assist. And even on 3 of them, he has something like the secondary assist. Like, he is everywhere. But you could argue that if you take David out the team, you can still find a way to survive. You take Bombito out the team, like, this defense just completely doesn't look anywhere near the same. So I think that's where you could win that argument.
We'll jump into some bigger picture talk for the CanMNT. Of course, they wrapped up 2024 last night. And a question from Matt12 Mark. With Canada's current form and talent pool, is it fair to consider anything but a trophy win in Nations League and the Gold Cup next year a failure? And I actually found Jesse Marsch to be very candid, very interesting about this last night when he spoke after the match, because he does want to win that trophy in March, but it's not necessarily, the priority. The priority is setting this program up to be good next June and be good the June after, and contend for the World Cup as best they possibly can. That long-term project is what is important to Marsch, and I don't think this necessarily matches, what we saw a couple years ago where Herdman was like, it's time to win a trophy, it's time to take that next step. It's going to be tough for Canada to go out and win a trophy. They play Mexico in the semifinal in LA. That is going to be a cauldron. Then it's likely the U.S. in a final, and the U.S. has had tremendous success when it comes to Nations League. So it's not going to be easy to go win a trophy in March. You'll have to see what kind of roster is called up for that as well. And the Gold Cup, we know, is going to be a bit of a B team just because of the Club World Cup happening at the same time in the same country as well. But it's not that priority, and I think that's interesting. And he was pretty candid about that last night. Even talking about, like, the U17s. Like, who would have thought, Marsch, not a Canadian, fresh in the job, would be so invested in, like, every element of this program.
Well, it's just talk about doing your job and then some. It's why Jesse Marsch has become a favored person ever since his hiring. But I'd say my answer is somewhere in between, because I think anything but a trophy is a dangerous mentality to have, just because there's so much that can go wrong, right? In the sense that if you look at it as, you don't get the trophy, it's a failure. 'Cause, a lot can happen where it's out of your control. But I do think, Canada should look at this like a strong chance to get a trophy. And I think a trophy would represent a natural progression for what they've become. They've become a top Concacaf team. I have no doubt of that. But the best way to...
Concacaf team?
Well, not to become the top, you got to win a trophy. So if they want to make that step from, we're in the top 3, I think that's not been in doubt for a while now. If you want to be the top, you want to be in those discussions, you got to put your hands on some silverware, plain and simple. If you want to be the kings of CONCACAF, you got to win a trophy. But also, at the same time, to put all your eggs in that basket is always dangerous. But at the same time, I think a lot of the excitement about wanting to win a trophy, and maybe you can argue if some of it's almost overboard, but the reality is Canada's set up super well to go win a trophy. Their player pool's in great shape across the board. They have depth they didn't have at certain positions. They've set themselves up so nicely that it's almost going to feel like a bit of a waste if they don't win a trophy. Like, this feels like they've got a generation. Like, if we were talking this way about the 2023 team, it feels like this 2025 team can blow that 2023 team out the water. And it feels like, because of that, it feels like a trophy is almost merited for it. But of course, you got to go out and earn it.
I think you can look at it in that respect, that this team is better than the 2023 team, and that's what we'll get into in our next question as well. But when you look at just the route they're going to have to take, that's going to be a tough semifinal and a tough final in March. In the Gold Cup, they're not going to have, their top players, the difference makers, and maybe that is enough that brings that level down. So I don't necessarily look at this in the same way as I did in 2023, where they mostly had the top guys. It was from the Nations League right into the Gold Cup back-to-back, and it was a very different mentality with that group. They'd achieved, the goal they wanted. They got to Qatar. Qatar didn't quite go to plan, and then that was the next step for that group. Whereas this group, it's a fairly new group. They haven't necessarily had that Nations League experience in the same way under Marsch, and so I don't think they actually need to go win a trophy. They need to get to the final. I'll say that. Like, they have to beat Mexico, but I'm not convinced that they go out and beat Mexico and then they go out and beat the U.S., assuming the U.S. beats Panama, at least in March.
Yeah, but at the same time, why not? Like, again, if this Canadian team wants to be a team that goes to a quarterfinal or a semifinal of the 26 World Cup, because look, you can say that's unrealistic, but that should be their goal, especially as a host nation, especially with how their pool's growing. I think this is a very good simulation of how that might look out knockout games against teams like Mexico, who maybe they lack the talent that they used to, but they still got pedigree, and against the U.S., who've got talent and pedigree. These are the tests you want. So I would still, I still think it's something where you can learn a lot from winning a trophy. I think winning a trophy now would set you up very nicely for 2026 round of 16 game in Vancouver, and your Canada versus pick your team. That experience. Oh yeah, remember we beat US and then in that knockout final in the US, could be immensely valuable. So I would say something where winning that trophy could learn a lot, because if this was their first final, and again they still have to reach the final, but they've reached a final in 2023. They felt the disappointment of coming up flat, of not putting in their best performance, of having regret. Now they got to take that, put that in the semifinal, reach the final, and then put that out in the final.
Mexico at SoFi Stadium is also going to be interesting, because if they finish second in their group of the World Cup and Mexico also finishes second, I believe they would play Mexico in that round of 16 or round of 32 at SoFi Stadium. And so it could be a bit of a preview. I might be wrong on that, but that's at least how I've understood the bracket, and a few other people have explained that to me as well in terms of where the hosts are seated in the tournament. But the question from Dubled at Gene Marciar: in 2023, Stefan Eustáquio was interviewed after the Nations League final loss to the U.S., and he said that our starting 11 is better than their 11. I think this is even more true now, and our depth is better now too. Do you agree? I still think it's tough to say that Canada's depth is better than the U.S. because the U.S. just has so many players that are playing at a top level. The 11, though, and the way that they've delivered with the national team recently, I think Canada has that edge. The question that remains, though, is how good is this U.S. men's national team once Pochettino gets them going? And unfortunately, Pulisic goes out, does some little funny dance moves, and that overshadows what was a very good performance from the U.S. against Jamaica, and nobody's talking about how the U.S. looks kind of frightening again against a good Jamaican side. And so it's going to be interesting to see that, like, where this U.S. team goes. Pulisic is having an outstanding season, even if we don't agree with his dance moves. But like the U.S., we don't know what their cap is. So I would actually still give them the advantage in this.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? In terms of the 11, I definitely think at the time it was a bit of a reach. Let's be honest, right? Because at the time you'd say what in 2023, Davies, David, maybe Eustáquio. That's about it, right? Like that was kind of the argument where I think now there's a legitimate. Because if I'm going like for like, look, I think you take Davies over Jedi Robinson. Anthony Robinson, love him, great player. But I think Davies gets that edge. He's top class. Jonathan David, that's 2 for Canada. I think Bombito for 3. The U.S. defense did not look the most convincing in either leg against Jamaica. I think Bombito's 3rd. The U.S. goalkeeper situation has been pretty rough. A lot of guys not playing, so I think you could argue Crepo or based on how he's been playing for Atlanta. I know you're bringing the MLS angle there, but it's not far-fetched based on form. I think you take St. Clair or Crepo, so that's 4 guys I'd comfortably say, and then the rest could be in debates. Like you always feel like a Kone or Eustáquio, one of the 2 could make it in that midfield. And then that's 5 Canadians. So I'd say it's a lot closer. In terms of depth, though, you mentioned it, and I think the big edge that Canada would have is not depth necessarily in terms of bodies, but in terms of right now what's nice with Canada, all these guys you mentioned, Jonathan David is going to put on that national team shirt and do a job. Davies is going to do a job. Eustáquio, Kone, Bombito. Those are the core guys, the core 5, if you want to call them. But what's nice is, Shaffelburg's going to put on that national team and look great. You know that Ahmed's putting on that shirt and he looks fantastic. All these other guys, Johnston, Cornelius. You look at the depth guys, right? That come off the bench. Larea, what a series he had here against Suriname. Like Canada has depth that what you have, and I think that's the big thing that Pochettino needs to get out of this U.S. This U.S. pool's good. This U.S. pool's been very good for a while now, but there's been a lot of question marks of how they play for club and country, and I think getting more out of that, we started to see it. Like Tanner Tessman this window was great for the U.S. That's something if they can get more out of that. good. Ricardo Pepi looked great. But a lot of times it's been a lot of where do they fit in? I think that's what Pochettino has the biggest shoes to fill, so to speak.
And it might be a little bit tinfoil hat theory, but I wonder whether the political potential unrest in that team actually begins to impact their on-field performance. Because I'm 100% sure that, not everybody necessarily agrees with, what Christian Pulisic did after scoring against Jamaica. And could that, cause some unrest within the team and potentially where they could get to? You wouldn't want to see that necessarily impact the sporting side of things, but we've seen it before in pro sports, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it, rock the boat a little bit within that USMNT locker room.
Yeah, we'll have to see, because, with this American team, they also do have strong unity. You can see it in this window. Like, guys are together, and I think they've done a good job of, kind of letting that not get in their way, because it has been something that over this cycle they've dealt with, right? Like the Trump presidency from 2016 to 2020, a lot of these guys were there at the tail end of it. Now they're here now. So I don't know how much of a factor that will play in, but hey, it's always something Pochettino will have to manage. And that's international football. Things can change quick. Canada went from a brotherhood to chaos back to a brotherhood. Like things can happen fast. So you just kind of got to be ready. And hey, usually winning tends to be a pretty good remedy for any sort of dressing room unrest.
Yeah, well, Stefan Estacio dropped the brotherhood buzzword in his press conference last night, and everybody gives a good chuckle whenever that comes up as well. But from Dan Clark 999 and Adam at Joe_Sewage, big picture question, but what are the biggest takeaways from 2024, and what are the aspects of this team that you like heading into 2025? And from Adam at Joe_Sewage, hard not to be happy with the CanMNT's 2024. A year ago, we were wondering if the program had peaked during World Cup qualifying, and now we're wondering what's possible in 2026. And I think what we saw this year, first of all, the Marsch hiring. That was only halfway through the year, and that changed the direction of everything in this program. And that's gone better than I think anybody could have expected, because he's had so much investment and so much care and so much, just detailed respect for wanting to bring Canada, wanting to be sort of an adopted Canadian. He spoke about that last night too. And, organizationally, they brought in a whole bunch of new staff to kind of reset this program. Unfortunately, on the women's national team side that affected the men's national team side, there was the drone stuff. And that definitely had an impact and continues to have an impact. That's not going to be done. I'd imagine that we're going to hear some more news on that moving forward from the FIFA investigation and potentially other rulings as well, whether that's from MLS, TFC, Canada Soccer, FIFA, Concacaf. Like this story is not done. But when you look at the men's national team, they achieved what they needed to. There was the disappointment of not initially getting to Copa, and then they found their way to Copa through the play-in. Copa, they did everything they possibly could have. They delivered, and when they got that opportunity at Copa, they discovered new players as well. We saw good performances from young guys like Luc de Fougerolles. Last night we see Jamie Knight-Labelle play. We saw the emergence of this new core of the men's national team, which a year ago it was still that mishmash of the 2022 core and transitioning to a new era, but we didn't really know where it was going because it was Biello. We didn't have a coach. Whereas now there's an identity, as you say. There's a core five. There's a baseline to build on. And we can see how good that baseline can be. And then you see the young players that could have an impact in 2026 and 2030 and going forward.
Yeah, impressive there to tie that all together in terms of you had me there for a second in the first half of drones. Where's this going? But you didn't drone on too long. But in terms of the biggest takeaways, the big one's an identity. I think that was the biggest call after John Herdman was. While there was nice in a sense, especially for qualifiers, that Canada's identity was to surprise, to be flexible, it had kind of hit its ceiling in the sense of ultimately what we see internationally, especially when you have less time to work together, you need an identity. You need something that this is what you're going to do. And then you can be flexible, right? You can modify. Sometimes you can do this, you can do that. And I think Canada had lacked that identity because you'd say under Herdman, what was the identity? Was it playing with the ball? Was it counterattacking? Was it there was question marks. And I think now there's an identity. You look at Canada, they're going to press you. That when they have the ball, they're going to try to play vertical and direct. Like I've been jokingly starting to use the Marsch ball, right? That's the thing. But I can explain to you Marsch ball. I can show you a game and I will break down. All right, these are clips of Marsch ball. I had one yesterday where it was like they had this build-up sequence where it was like 4 or 5 passes, from left back all the way to them making a run in behind him. Like, that's Marsch ball. It's vertical. You have guys running off the ball, all this stuff. I think that identity is huge because they're going to need to build around that 2026. And we talked about it when Marsch was hired, and I think it's become clear. This team fits Marsch ball. Like, Shaffelburg, that guy, he's Marsch ball. He is Marsch ball. Jonathan David, I mean, to be fair with David, I think you could put him under any coach in the world and he'll fit that. But David is fit nicely into Marsch ball. You see these guys, Eustachio Chouanier, that pivot fits so well into what Marsch is asking him to do. The back line, Bombito, what a find he's been for Marsch. So I think the identity has been a big one. Another one has just been the overall improvement of players. Like I mentioned, we have to remember Bombito was nowhere on the radar of like starting at center back going forward. Like heading into this year, and now he's like, you don't even, he's a lock. He's a core 5, like I mentioned earlier. So it's been huge to see them have that. Now they just have depth at every position. Like you can look across the positions and be like, all right, you're comfortable at striker, at 10, at wing, at midfield, at left back, right back, center back, goalkeeper, and there's real competition in their squad. Like that's what's nice. There's a hunger. Marsch has kept things open. It hasn't just been, here's my guys, those are my guys, and that's it. And we kind of worried about that at Copa America, but I think he's done a great job since of like, now in midfield, there's 4 or 5 guys fighting for 2 spots. Out wide, there's 3 or 4 guys fighting for 2 spots. Up front, it's a heck of a fight for minutes. At the back, even, there's starting to be competition. Waterman slots in, does a job. Kamal Miller slots in, does a job. Richie Larea, like, there's a realistic chance in the Nations League semifinals, one of Richie Larea, Alistair Johnson, and Alphonso Davies might not start. I think we're safe to know it's Davies will start. One of Johnson or Larea not starting, that's wild to think, but that depth, that competition is there. So that's a huge takeaway that I really like from Marsch, the way he stoked the fire in this team.
You mentioned that Jacob Shaffelburg is, a Marsch ball player, and his performances with the men's national team have been a lot better than they were with Nashville this year. And I guess the question with Nashville is he going to be a BJ ball player? Anyways, we'll move on to the next question from Northern Football fan at Porter BC 1409. How can we get more fans into the stands regardless of the opponent? I hate seeing empty stadium. It was a good vibe last night. I will give it that. 13,000 is underwhelming. I think a lot of that has to do with the opponent. Not many people, unless you're a bit of a CONCACAF sicko, know that Suriname is actually a decent team and a decent test. A lot of people don't know where it is on a map, and that is not a draw. Davies wasn't there. That's not a draw. It was wet. It was cold. That's not a draw. And there's a lot of the men's national team in Toronto, and I know that that's what basically everybody wants us to get into, is playing in other locations. Being in Toronto, I do like that it's in Toronto. It definitely feels like that's a home stadium for Canada Soccer. Like the Canada Soccer logo is around that stadium. It's a home stadium in a lot of ways. But the vibe was good, just not enough people. And I don't think that necessarily has to do with Canada or Toronto. I think it has to do with the opponent, the weather. People are watching hockey and basketball at this point instead of soccer. The MLS season has been done for a while. But then again, if you put it in Vancouver, are you getting a bigger crowd? Probably.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a lot of factors, right? I also think the weather, right? November in Toronto can't be the most appetizing draw in terms of, sitting out and sacrificing yourself in the stands. But yeah, I guess what this shows, and it's going to be a big challenge, is like there's a hunger, there's an appetite in soccer for things that that are known, like World Cup qualifiers. People know, right? Because it's like you're qualifying for the World Cup, or it's tournaments. People know tournaments, but the reality is a Nations League. It's a good reminder that it's not caught on. Like Nations League is in our vernacular. We know what Nations League is, but to the general conscience, like what's a Nations League? Why is it called that? Why does it sound like some sort of like political event and not some sort of soccer tournament? Like
League of Nations?
That's it. Like it sounds like some sort of, it doesn't even sound like a tournament. And then what surprised me, but then again, remember, not everyone's a sicko in the sense, like people don't know where Suriname is. People like if you gave people a Suriname flag, they might not know what the flag is. There's the nation one is a big one. So that's just something that I think that's going to happen across the country. Because maybe in Vancouver there might have been more fans in the stands, but it's still maybe going to be 15, 16, 17, 20,000, right? Because they got 17,000 for Curacao in a very equivalent game in 2022. I think it's just shows how much work needs to be done to like show these games matter a lot. Like this is a big game. This was an exciting game. I think the reality is that, it didn't. You see it out there, right? It just it didn't register in the general conscience the same way. And I think that's not gonna change regardless of the city where the game is at.
Yeah, I mean, heck, I saw a friend that was, at exhibition station, and he had no idea the game was going on. Like, I'm like, I'm going to the game. Why don't you buy a ticket? They're whatever, $20 or whatever to get in, and he had no idea that Canada was playing a game. Now, he's not the biggest soccer fan, but in World Cup qualifying, people get on that bandwagon and will go to the games, will follow the team. Whereas Suriname in the Nations League, not a draw. No Davies, not much of a draw. Like, there's just less.
Well,
it's a less sexy event, right? Like,
well, I'm just going
to a better term.
Build on it. World Cup qualifiers are easy to explain. You qualify for the World Cup. Usually there's some sort of pre-built format. If you were to explain to someone the Nations League, so Canada and three other teams, they got a bye to the quarterfinals. They got dropped straight in the quarterfinals, and then they played this team, Suriname, who they were drawn with, because based on this Concacaf ranking, you ever see Concacaf ranking? It's this cool index, and they were drawn with Suriname because Suriname had the third best record out of the four top qualifying teams out of the group stage of the Nations League, where there were 6-team groups, and not everyone played each other in those groups, by the way. Now you go to the semifinals. The semifinals are reseeded based on quarterfinal performance. You get you're gonna lose.
There's points too. There's points. It's not about goal differential or standings. There are points.
Like, I would have lost most people I tried explaining that. 3 seconds into that explanation? We know that, we're used to it, but I think also with CONCACAF, that's something where Nations League is cool, Nations League exciting, but man, they make it tough for people to get into that, because it's just so there's just so many moving parts. I even so many questions out there last night of why are Canada playing Mexico and not Panama? How does it work? How did the system work? A lot of stuff, and it's just that's the one big thing with Nations League.
I mean, Brendan and I were sitting in the press box with a few other journalists, and we were trying to figure out, does Canada play Mexico or Panama based on, if Mexico scores 1 or 2 more goals. And then I'm like, I'm just going to wait till Alex tweets it or Blue Skies it, and then I'll trust that. But from Chris Corrigan, how are we going to take the next step into the Gold Cup? I don't think there's taking a next step into the Gold Cup. As much as I would like to see it, it's not going to be a top-choice roster, so I don't think you can necessarily take a next step. The step can be continuing to play with the depth, with the identity, and then going into that tournament, because you're confident in what you are in terms of your identity, you can go in and potentially challenge for that trophy, because both the U.S. and Mexico are going to be hit similarly. But I would actually favor Mexico in terms of players they're going to be missing for the Gold or for the Club World Cup will be less so than the other two countries.
Absolutely. I think for the Gold Cup, I will continue to call needs to be every 4 years. Every 2 years just is too much, and I think teams take it less seriously than they should because of that. So I think that's a big issue. But for Canada, I think what the next step for them represents is, all right, like I mentioned earlier with Jesse Marsch and the big picture takeaways, you've got an identity and you've got depth. This is the chance to go prove it. You've seen that in the past with the U.S. for, their success they had at Gold Cups is because no matter if they had a B team, C team, they knew how they were going to play. They knew they were going to go out. They knew they were going to compete. And I think with Canada, this is a chance to prove that, okay, if there's no David and Davies and Eustachio and Buchanan, those are all guys that could potentially miss Club World Cup. You maybe think a Bombito gets some rest after a long season. Johnston, you're assuming you're missing all those guys. All right, if your back line is Larea, Adekugbe, Kamal Miller, Joel Waterman, are you still going to get the same performances? Is the same job going to be done? If your midfield pivot is a Saliba and someone else, are you still going to get the same performances? If your wingers are Shaffelburg, Ahmed, well, they're already your starting wingers, so you're in good position there. And then up front, we'll see. That's a chance to really prove that this depth is good enough to stand on its own. That you're missing some of your core guys, because that's, I think, where Mexico and the U.S. have really done well, is that even when they're missing guys, you still see the elements of what makes them the U.S. and Mexico. And Canada's taken steps in that regard. 2021 and 2023, they showed in those big games they can go head to head, toe to toe. But I think this 2025 Gold Cup, you really want to see them prove they can be favorites, even if missing 6 to 10 guys.
And from Blair Donnelly at Medic1849, any update with where we can anticipate watching the CPL and the CanMNT and CanWNT in 2025? From all sounds of it, likely still going to be one soccer. NSL will be on TSN and CBC. But it seems like, one soccer is in a decent position from at least the outside looking in.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll just have to see how it goes, right? In the sense that, no doubt, people in this country are talking about how do you make the national teams, both of them, But, especially from the men's national team perspective, heading into a 2026 World Cup, how do you make them more accessible? How do you make it that when there's a game like yesterday, which is a big game, but maybe doesn't register in the conscience as a big game, of how do you get more eyeballs on that? And I do think it's something where, if things stay the same, I think what we saw over the last year in terms of like a CBC picking up the CPL final and other things of the like could be a way we see some of these games pushed more widely going forward. So, because I think that's something that it seems to be clear from like a Mark Noonan, for example, in a lot of the way that he's talked, right? That he likes that model of you keep the same platform, right? So you got the streaming. Streaming is a big thing in 2024. It's not going away, but then you find a way to distribute that streaming then onto different platforms.
Yeah, I do think that it is important that you have that mix. I personally would love to see, the CPL, for example, be included in a Sportsnet Plus, an Amazon Prime, a TSN Plus, or whatever their premium subscription is, because more people subscribe to those to watch NHL, NBA, F1, NASCAR, whatever. If you can have the CPL as a One Soccer production as an option to watch on there, I think you're getting to more people, and it's still behind a paywall, but it's still more people, and you can probably get maybe a cut of those subscriptions or something like that. For the national team, I think offering every game to a broadcaster, whether it's CBC, TSN, Sportsnet, heck, like offer them to the likes of Global, and just see if anyone wants to pay even a little bit of money to just get eyes on the men's and women's national teams. And I'm sure that there could be that option. We saw it during World Cup qualifying. The stock is only going to rise in these teams. I think TSN would be excited for it, even though their investment in Canadian soccer can be like touch and go sometimes, it seems. I think CBC would be excited for it. Who knows really about Sportsnet and what their outlook is, with the change of MLSE ownership and such like that. But I think TSN and CBC would be enticed by showing the men's national team and the women's national team. How do they go about that, right? But I think in theory they would like that.
Well, I think the big plus too is that assuming the model stays the same, and we'll see what happens in that regard. But the fact that there's been production taken care of for these men's and women's national team games in CPL, right? That there's going to be trucks there's going to be a feed, there's going to be a panel, there's going to be commentators. That's so much easier to stomach in terms of like just air to TV, right? Because it's like, we don't need to like buy this and then invest a lot of money into putting your own cameras, putting your own talent, doing all that. That does also help clear a hurdle in terms of just, being accessible to just boom, take stream, and because that's kind of what you saw in the World Cup with Sportsnet, right? Qualifiers,
yeah.
At least.
And TSN sort of for one game, but I do think that you have to look at who's going to be producing these games next year as well, because Media Pro is leaving Canada. And so you're going to have to look at, who is producing the CanMNT, CanWNT, and the CPL, and that doesn't seem like, at least publicly, that question has been answered. But we'll jump into quick Canadians abroad as well as we wrap up our CanMNT recap of this window and for 2024. For a full roundup of the latest on the Canucks abroad, check out the Canucks abroad Twitter. Kadisha Buchanan has torn her ACL, becoming the latest Canadian to suffer a major knee injury. Tough blow for Canada and Buchanan, who was in excellent form. And Gabby Carl is going to the NWSL Championship with the Washington Spirit as they'll face the Orlando Pride after beating Gotham in a thrilling match. Her big year continues, and then Canadian men continuing to thrive in Europe. Carolyn Kerr has been continuing to thrive as well in Germany and could potentially be called up because the CanWNT does have two friendlies coming up in the end of November and the beginning of December to wrap up the year of Canadian international soccer.
Yeah, and while the squad for that will be out on a Thursday of this week, we're recording on a Wednesday. Tight schedules, man. It would have been nice if they could have dropped that squad on Wednesday. We could have hit it all on at once. But I guess, for things to keep an eye out in that squad is who steps up and replaces Buchanan and Lacasse, right? Because those are two big absences. I think a Buchanan could open the door for some interesting young names. Maybe someone who did well at the U20 World Cup, for example. I think it was the U20 World Cup, right? Where like Zoe Marcassani did really well at the back. Maybe she gets a look. I know based on the college seasons, it might make it tough for some of those players, but I know, for example, like Anaya Rose is out. So you talk about a forward, someone who could step in for Lacasse, maybe get Anaya Rose. you're in Europe, you're in Spain, call up players doing well in Europe. Kerr is probably among the top on that list of someone we've been looking at. Of course, she's a bit older, but maybe there's some other names you could look at, like a Chandra Davidson you throw into that mix. Bit of a slower start of the year for Benfica than she would have hoped. But it's good that Canada will be playing friendlies with Iceland, South Korea. It's good they have some clarity now on the future, as in like there's going to be a new head coach. And now what I hope is it's a bit of a departure from what we saw in the last window, where it's more like continuity, just keeping things going, good vibes. Help this new intern, this new head coach, whoever is brought in as the intern for this one, help them. Put your stamp on things, put in some new faces, play around with things, because I think these opponents are good where they're good, but Canada can experiment and not feel like, man, we're going to get destroyed by a Spain because we tried a new formation, right? Like, I think against Iceland, South Korea, you can find that balance where it'll still be competitive, but it'd be fun to see Canada experiment with new players and new positions, new formations, mixing up the attack, for example. Lots of things you could do.
And a few other happenings in Canadian soccer this week as well. Joel Waterman signs a contract with CF Montreal through 2027 and a team option for 2028. And then a few more NSL signings as well. The Calgary Wild signed goaltender Sarah Kilty-Dilling and fullback Grace Storty. Two local players. They come back. NCAA standouts, and AFC Toronto signs Leah Pais just today. She apparently was at the CanMNT game last night and met some fans. Dave DeCola, I think, is a loyal listener of ours, and he apparently met her, but she turned her back to the camera as to not unveil her signing with the NSL in a pre-match selfie last night. But three quality players, and I think we're starting to see, it is going to be these NCAA standouts that have ties to the area and are able to come back and realize their professional dreams in the NSL, and that's kind of what we expected, when we were talking about building these rosters.
Well, I think the core backbone of the league for the first 2 to 3 years is going to need to be those sorts of players where, like, someone, what's interesting in some of these cases is, like, some of these players could be playing in NWSL. They're good enough to play for in the NWSL. It's not like as if it's a matter of, talent, say, right? Or it's more passport opportunity. Sometimes it can be tough to make that jump from college up to that level. And I think Leah Pais is an example of that, where she did well in the college level, but then she had to go to Iceland to get the chance, right? The famed Chloe Lacasse route. I think having these players come in and immediately have an impact will be key for the league, because it's going to take a while for the established names to join, but I think having a backbone of young players with potential to improve and maybe move on is always a good way to raise the floor of the league.
And Kilty-Dilling, a little bit older as well, not straight out of the NCAA, but certainly going to be interesting to see how these rosters continue to build. I, of course, am excited to see some of the U Sports players that are bound to sign. It seems like there are at least 20 players signed to the league at this point, just waiting to be announced, and it seems like a lot more will start to quickly be announced too, because kickoff's coming up. But that's all we've got for episode 203 of the Northern Football Podcast, our post-match episode as Canada get past Suriname in the men's national team in the Nations League to close out 2024. An exciting 2024, but for Brendan, Alex, I've been Ben. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow. You can watch us on the 90th Minute and all the different places as well. Thanks so much for tuning in.